The sun was dipping low behind the horizon, washing the open plains in gold and amber. The creak of wagon wheels blended with the steady rhythm of hooves, and the gentle chatter of her family floated in the cool evening air. The smell of fresh-baked bread from the morning still lingered in the covered wagon, and the soft sway of the journey felt almost like a lullaby. She sat beside her mother, holding her little sister's hand, while her father guided the lead horse with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his life on the trail. It was a peaceful journey, one of those rare moments when the world felt kind. A small breeze stirred her hair, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant campfire smoke. Her brother was riding a little ahead, pretending to be a scout, his hat tipped low to imitate their father. Laughter filled the air when he turned to wave back, the setting sun outlining him like a silhouette carved from light. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the peace soak in, not knowing that the sound she would hear next would shatter that peace forever. It began faintly, like the low rumble of thunder far away. Then the rhythm changed. Hooves. Too many hooves. Her father stiffened, his hand tightening on the reins. Before she could ask what was wrong, a shout ripped through the air, harsh and sharp, followed by the crack of a rifle. The horses screamed. The wagon jolted violently. Her little sister cried out, clutching her arm. Bandits burst from the tall grass, faces hidden under dusty scarves, eyes glinting with cruelty. Gunfire erupted in all directions. Her father shouted for them to run, but there was nowhere to run. Her brother's horse reared, throwing him to the ground. She tried to reach for him, but her mother's trembling hands shoved her toward the wagon's underbelly. "Stay there. Don't move," her mother whispered fiercely, her voice breaking. Then her mother was gone, drawn into the chaos of screaming horses, shouting men, and the smell of smoke and gunpowder. From the shadow beneath the wagon, she watched it all. Boots thudded against the dirt inches from her face. The sharp crack of gunfire rattled her bones. She saw her brother crawling toward their father, only for a rough hand to yank him away. Her mother's shawl lay on the ground, torn and trampled. Every sound was too loud, yet somehow muffled by the pounding in her ears. A sudden blast shook the wagon above her, showering her with splinters. One of the wheels collapsed, tipping the whole frame. She bit her lip to keep from screaming, clamping both hands over her mouth as she saw a man fall lifeless only a few feet away. His blood spread dark across the dirt, soaking into the earth. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the noise started to fade. The hoofbeats receded into the distance, carrying with them whatever they hadn't destroyed. She waited, heart hammering, afraid to move. The only sounds now were the crackle of something burning nearby and the moan of the wind across the empty trail. When she finally crawled out, the world was wrong. The wagon lay on its side, the supplies scattered like broken memories across the ground. The horses were gone. Her father's hat rested upside down in the dust, but he was nowhere in sight. She called for her mother, for her brother, her voice raw, but only the echo of her own fear answered her. She stumbled forward, tripping over debris, her knees sinking into the cold dirt. The air was sharp, the night creeping in faster now. In the middle of the mess, her hand found something soft, her little sister's scarf, torn along the edge. She held it to her chest, as though clutching it could somehow bring her family back. The plain stretched endless around her, no lanterns, no voices, no signs of life, only the distant outline of mountains and the deepening blue of night. The cold crept in fast, biting at her skin, but she barely felt it. Her legs folded beneath her, and she sank into the dust, tears streaming silently down her face. Somewhere far away, a coyote howled, its cry thin and lonely under the stars. She hugged the scarf tighter, rocking slightly as if to comfort herself, her breath trembling in the dark. She had no food, no horse, no family, nothing but the torn piece of cloth in her hands. And in that moment, under the wide, merciless sky, she understood the truth. She was completely, terrifyingly alone. The night had been merciless. She had not slept. Every sound in the darkness seemed sharper, hungrier. The wind hissed through the tall grass, and somewhere far off, something moved. She had crouched inside the broken shell of the wagon, clutching her sister's torn scarf and staring at the stars until they blurred into tears. By the time the horizon began to pale, she felt colder inside than the morning air could ever make her. She rose stiffly, her legs aching from hours of crouching, her lips cracked and dry. There was no plan, only one thought repeating in her head. Find people, find safety. She looked toward the rising sun and guessed the settlement they had been traveling to lay somewhere in that direction. Her father had spoken of it often. Small but welcoming, a place where they could finally start fresh. The memory made her chest ache. The trail was nothing more than faint ruts in the dirt, marked by hoof prints that led away from wreckage. She followed them at first, each step heavy. The sun climbed quickly, burning away the morning chill, replacing it with dry heat that pressed down on her shoulders. Her stomach growled, the emptiness twisting into pain, but there was nothing to eat. She remembered the loaf of bread her mother had wrapped in cloth, but it was gone, taken by the raiders or lost in the dust. Hours passed, the open plain stretching endless in every direction. Her mind wandered in the silence, slipping into memories she hadn't asked for. Her father's voice, deep and steady, telling stories by the fire. Her brother's laugh when he managed to catch a fish bigger than his hand. Her little sister singing softly to herself as she sewed crooked stitches in a rag doll. The pictures were so vivid she almost turned to speak to them, only to be met by the empty wind. By midday, her shoes began to give way. The rough trail had chewed at the stitching until the leather flapped uselessly. Every step sent small stones biting into her soles. The skin at the back of her heel had torn, warm blood mixing with dust. She stopped briefly to pull the shoes tighter, but it did little good. Her legs trembled when she tried to keep walking. That night, she found no shelter, only a hollow in the earth where the grass grew sparse. The sky was wide and cold, the stars sharp against the black. She lay curled on the hard ground, shivering. At first she thought she was imagining the sound, but then it came again, low, drawn out and chilling. A wolf's howl, then another, closer. Her breath quickened, her pulse thudding in her ears. She had no fire, no weapon. All she could do was press herself against the earth and pray they wouldn't find her. The howls faded eventually, but sleep never came. She waited for the first hint of light, then pushed herself up and stumbled forward again. The land grew harsher. Patches of cracked earth, loose stones that rolled under her feet. She fell more than once, her hands scraping raw against the ground. Her vision blurred, spots dancing before her eyes. She could no longer tell how long she had been walking. Her throat felt like it was lined with sand, and her lips bled when she tried to wet them with her tongue. Her steps slowed until they were more like drags. Somewhere in the distance, the faint outline of a road cut across the land. She fixed her gaze on it, using what little strength she had left. By the time she reached it, her body had given up on her. She fell to her knees in the dust, her breath shallow and ragged. The road stretched in both directions, empty. She tried to stand, but her legs folded under her. The world tilted, the light blurring into shadow. The last thing she saw before everything went black was a single vulture circling high above her, its wings slicing the pale sky. And then there was nothing. The afternoon sun burned high over the plains, spilling its light across miles of dry grass and dusty road. Heat shimmered in the distance, blurring the horizon into a wavering mirage. Somewhere along that endless road, a lone figure rode slowly, his broad-shouldered frame straight in the saddle, the brim of his weathered hat casting his face in shadow. The horse beneath him moved with the steady patience of a creature that had crossed these lands 100 times before. He was a kind of man the plains seemed to recognize, rugged, tall, and silent, as much a part of this wild country as the wind itself. His shirt clung with dust and sweat, the faint creak of his saddle leather, the only sound besides a horse's hooves. He carried no expression on his face, only the calm watchfulness of a man used to reading the land for trouble. It was that watchfulness that caught it. A shape lying ahead on the road, still and small against a vast emptiness. He slowed his horse, narrowing his eyes beneath the brim of his hat. At first, he thought it was nothing more than a bundle of rags discarded by a passing wagon. But as he drew closer, his jaw tightened. It wasn't rags, it was a person. He swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. The woman lay half-turned on her side, hair tangled with dust, skin pale and dry. Her lips were cracked, and her breathing came in shallow, uneven pulls. Her clothes were torn at the edges, and in her hand, clutched like it was the only thing keeping her alive, was a small, tattered scarf. Without a word, he unfastened the canteen from his saddle and knelt beside her. He lifted her gently, tilting the canteen to her lips. At first, she didn't respond, but then the water touched her mouth, and she swallowed greedily. A faint sound escaped her throat, somewhere between a sob and a gasp. "Easy," he said, his voice low and steady, like he was speaking to a frightened animal. Slow sips. Her eyes fluttered open for the first time, dazed and unfocused. She saw him only in fragments, shadowed face, square jaw, dark eyes that didn't flinch. His hands were rough but careful as he steadied her. When she tried to speak, the words came out broken. "Wah, where?" "Don't talk," he said simply, shaking his head. "You're safe enough for now." He reached for his coat, a heavy, worn thing lined with faded flannel, and draped it over her shoulders. The scent of leather and wood smoke clung to it, oddly comforting. He glanced at the sky, gauging the fading light, and then back at her. "You can't stay out here," he said. "Not another hour." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing as if weighing whether she could trust him. In her mind, the images of the bandit raid still burned fresh, and every stranger's face was a possible threat. But his voice carried no demand, no force, just a matter-of-fact tone of a man stating a truth. He rose and walked to his horse, untying a blanket from the saddle. When he returned, he slipped an arm under her knees and another behind her back. She was too weak to protest, her head resting against his chest as he lifted her effortlessly. "Where?" she managed. "My place," he replied. "You'll get food, water, rest." Her instinct was to refuse, to say she didn't need anyone, that she could make it to the settlement herself. But one look at the endless road behind him and the emptiness ahead told her she wouldn't last a night. She gave the faintest nod. He set her gently in the saddle before mounting behind her, one arm steadying her so she wouldn't slip. The horse started forward at an easy pace, its hooves drumming a slow rhythm on the dirt. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sun dipped lower, shadows lengthening across the plains. She could feel the steady rise and fall of his breathing against her back, the quiet strength in the way he held her just firmly enough to keep her steady, without caging her in. Once, she glanced over her shoulder at him. His eyes were fixed ahead, scanning the land like he expected trouble at any moment. But when he noticed her looking, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, like he was silently telling her she was safe now. And for the first time since the raid, she let herself believe it might be true. The road stretched endlessly before them, a narrow ribbon of dust cutting through seas of tall, swaying grass. The sun was already dipping low, its golden light spilling over the plains in long, warm strokes. Shadows stretched like fingers across the earth, and every gust of wind carried the softest of grass brushing against itself. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried, its lonely call fading into the distance. She sat in front of him on the saddle, feeling the rhythmic sway of the horse beneath them. The cowboy's arm rested lightly around her waist, steadying her without restraint. His presence was quiet, almost like the landscape itself, strong, unyielding, but not demanding attention. Every so often, she felt his gaze sweep the horizon, as if he was always watching for danger. Neither of them spoke for a long while. She tried once to ask his name, but he only said, "Cole," in a tone that hinted it was all she needed to know. When she asked where they were headed, he simply answered, "My place, North Ridge." His words were few, but something in the way he said them, calm and certain, was enough to keep her from asking more. Instead, she began to tell him small pieces of herself, half because she needed to fill the silence, half because the emptiness inside her ached to be heard. She spoke of her family's plans to start a new life in the settlement, of the wagon days that felt like they'd been years ago instead of only 2. Her voice cracked when she spoke of her little sister, and she quickly looked away, blinking hard. Cole didn't interrupt. He didn't say he understood, didn't offer hollow comfort. He just listened. The sun fell lower, setting the grass aglow in deep orange and rust. The air cooled, carrying the scent of earth and wild sage. Cole slowed the horse as they reached a small cluster of cottonwood trees beside a shallow stream. "We'll stop here," he said, dismounting. He helped her down gently, his hands firm under her arms. Without a word, he loosened the saddle straps, letting the horse graze nearby, then fetched a worn leather satchel from behind the saddle. Inside was a small pan, a bundle of bread wrapped in cloth, and a pouch of dried meat. He crouched near the stream, filling a tin cup of water, and handed it to her first. "Drink." The water was cold and sharp, and she swallowed greedily until he told her to slow down. Then he set about making a small fire, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times. She sat nearby, pulling his coat tighter around her, watching his hands as they worked. Steady, deliberate, never wasting motion. When the fire crackled to life, he sliced the bread and warmed it over the flames, adding strips of dried meat to the pan until the air filled with the smell of cooking. He handed her a simple tin plate, not waiting for thanks, and began to eat his portion in silence. She hesitated, then asked softly, "Do you live alone?" He chewed for a moment before answering. "Mostly." "And before?" His gaze stayed on the fire. "Had a wife. Long time back." The way he said it, short, final, told her it wasn't a subject he spoke of often. She didn't ask how or why. Still, the air between them shifted slightly, carrying a weight of unspoken loss. She understood that weight too well. They ate without rushing, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the occasional soft snore from a horse. When the plates were empty, he banked the fire low and spread a blanket for her beside it. She laid down, feeling the hard earth beneath but grateful for the warmth. Above them, the sky stretched wide and endless, the stars sharp and countless. Cole sat a little apart, leaning against the saddle, hat tipped low over his eyes. He didn't look at her, but she felt the quiet watchfulness in his presence, like a wall between her and the dark. For the first time since the raid, she closed her eyes without fear. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but in the circle of firelight, with a steady breathing somewhere nearby, the cold edge of loneliness seemed to fade just enough to let sleep take her. The next morning, the ride felt longer than the day before. The sun rose slow and steady, burning away the mist clinging to the plains. Cole kept the horse at an even pace, only pausing once for her to drink from the stream and stretch her aching legs. As the day wore on, the land began to change. Rolling hills gave way to flat stretches of prairie, then to scattered patches of cottonwood and cedar. Finally, the faint outline of a house appeared on the horizon, its shape small but solid against the open sky. When they reached it, she saw it was more than just a house. It was a working ranch. Weathered fences stretched in either direction, enclosing grazing land where a few cattle moved lazily under the sun. A barn stood off to the side. Its red paint faded to a dull brown, and the main house, though modest, had an air of quiet endurance about it. The boards were worn, the porch steps creaked, but it looked sturdy, like it had faced years of wind and dust without complaint. Cole dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. His hands were steady and warm, but she felt a sudden nervousness take root in her stomach. This was his home, not hers. And even though he had saved her life, stepping onto that porch felt like stepping into another unknown. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke. The walls were bare except for a single shelf of books and a faded map nailed above the desk. The furniture was simple but well kept. Chairs with worn arms, a small table, and a stone fireplace dark with soot. Cole led her down a short hallway and opened a door to a small room. "This'll be yours," he said, standing in the doorway. The room was plain, a narrow bed against the wall, a small dresser, and a window that looked out over the pasture. There was no decoration, no softness, just a place to sleep. Still, it was clean, and the quilt folded at the end of the bed smelled faintly of sun and fresh air. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice low. Cole gave a brief nod and stepped back. "I'll get you some supper. You can rest." When the door closed behind him, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. The silence in the room felt heavy, not the dangerous silence of plains at night, but the unfamiliar kind that makes you aware you don't belong. She lay down, meaning only to rest her eyes, but exhaustion pulled her under. The dreams came quickly, too quickly. Gunfire, screams, the smell of smoke choking the air. She saw her brother fall, her mother's shawl ripped from her shoulders, the shadow of a man's hand reaching for her. Her breath caught in her throat as she bolted upright, heart pounding, the sound of her own ragged breathing filling the room. The knock at the door made her jump. "Supper." Cole's voice said, calm and steady. She opened the door to find him holding a plate, bread, beans, and a small cut of meat. "Eat while it's hot," he said, his gaze lingering for just a second on her pale face before he turned away. That evening she met someone new. Out by the barn, an older man was mending a fence, his hands calloused and his back slightly stooped. His hair was more silver than brown, but his eyes were sharp. When he noticed her, he tipped his hat with a small smile. "You must be the one Cole brought back from the road," he said. "Name's Walter. Been here longer than he has." She returned the smile shyly. I'm just passing through." Walter's eyes flicked toward the house, where Cole was checking the horses. "Maybe, but from where I'm standing, looks like he doesn't bring just anyone home." Heat rose to her cheeks, and she quickly looked down at the dirt. Walter chuckled softly, as if he'd already seen more than she realized. Over the next few days, she noticed the way people in town looked at her when Cole took her along for supplies. Some whispered, some stared openly. She heard a few words carried on the wind. Stray, trouble, doesn't belong. It made her shoulders tighten, but Cole didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did and simply didn't care. When one man at the general store made a pointed remark about charity cases, Cole's voice cut through the room like a blade. "She's with me," he said, each word sharp and final. "That's all you need to know." The man looked away quickly, muttering under his breath. Cole didn't wait for a response. He simply finished his purchase and led her outside. As they rode back toward the ranch, the sun setting behind them, she glanced at him. He didn't speak, didn't explain, but the set of his jaw told her everything. He wasn't just giving her a place to stay. He was making it clear to anyone who needed reminding she wasn't alone anymore. And for the first of mornings on the ranch began with the golden light of dawn spilling over the rolling hills, painting the sky with strokes of rose and gold. At first, she kept to herself, watching from the porch as he and the old ranch hand moved about with rhythm born of years of routine. But slowly, almost shyly, she began to step into the rhythm herself. The first time she offered to feed the chickens, he merely nodded, as if giving her silent permission. Soon, she found herself scattering grain across the dirt, smiling faintly when the hens darted in with greedy clucks. It wasn't much, but it was something, a thread binding her to a life that was slowly becoming her own. The cowboy noticed her efforts, though he rarely said much. One afternoon, he found her by the corral, leaning against a fence as she watched the horses. Without a word, he stepped beside her and gestured toward the smallest mare. "She's gentle," he said, his deep voice almost startling in the quiet. He saddled the horse and showed her how to mount, his hands steady as they guided hers on the reins. The first few tries were clumsy. She nearly slid off once, but he caught her each time, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. There were moments of laughter, rare but precious, like the day she accidentally let a bucket of water slip from her hands, drenching both of them. She gasped, covering her mouth in embarrassment, but he only shook his head and muttered, "Guess we're both due for a wash." It wasn't playful in a loud way. It was subtle, quiet, like everything else about him. These little exchanges began to chip away at the walls she'd built around her heart. One afternoon in town, while she lingered near the back of the general store, she overheard raised voices. The cowboy was speaking to two local men, his tone low but firm. "She's under my roof," he said. "That's all you need to know. And if you've got a problem with it, take it somewhere else." The word struck her harder than she expected. No one had stood up for her since the raid. No one had cared enough to risk their standing for her. She felt a lump rise in her throat as she realized what he had done. Not just in that moment, but from the start. That evening, as they sat by the fire, she watched him in silence, the flames dancing in his eyes. He didn't notice her gaze, or if he did, he pretended not to. She thought about the way he had given her shelter, taught her skills she never had, and now defended her name as if it were his own. Something in her shifted. Trust, fragile but real, had begun to take root. Time. The thought didn't scare her. The news came like a cold wind cutting through a warm day. Word spread quietly in town. Riders seen on the edge of the valley, their faces hidden, their movements too deliberate to be drifters. She didn't need anyone to tell her what it meant. Bandits. Her breath caught in her throat, and before she knew it, her hands were trembling. The shadows of that terrible night months ago pressed in on her again, and the old helplessness returned like an unwanted ghost. Back at the ranch, she moved through her chores as if in a dream, every creak of wood and snap of brush outside setting her nerves on edge. She tried not to show it, but the cowboy saw, that evening, as she stood on the porch staring toward the darkening hills. He came up beside her. "It's just talk for now," he said, his voice steady as ever. But she could hear the way his boots shifted on the boards, the way his eyes scanned the distance. He was preparing for trouble, too. When she finally admitted her fear, it came out in a rush. "If they come here, it'll be because of me. I brought this to your doorstep." The words were choked with guilt, and she couldn't meet his gaze. But he didn't hesitate. "I'd rather face bullets than lose you," he said, and there was no bravado in it. Just quiet certainty, the kind that leaves no room for argument. Her eyes stung, and for a long moment she couldn't speak. The ranch changed in subtle ways after that. Nights grew tense. The old ranch hand kept a rifle propped near the door, and the cowboy began walking the perimeter after sundown, his lantern a flicker of light against the darkness. She would lie awake, listening for hoofbeats in the distance, her heart thudding with every snap of a branch. More than once, she thought she heard something, only to realize it was a restless wind moving through the grass. One night, unable to sleep, she stepped outside to find him leaning against the corral fence, eyes fixed on the horizon. The moon painted silver over his shoulders, and for a moment she just watched him, wondering how a man could be so still and yet carry so much weight. When he noticed her, he gave a faint smile and tipped his hat, as if to say everything was under control. She didn't believe it entirely, but she wanted to. In the days that followed, the bandits never showed, but the tension never left. Every rider in the distance was a threat until proven otherwise. Every knock at the door made her pulse jump. Yet in the midst of it all, she began to notice something strange. Her fear was still there, but so was a growing sense of safety. Not because danger had disappeared, but because she wasn't facing it alone anymore. The storm rolled in without warning, a wall of dark clouds swallowing the horizon. By the time the first drops fell, the wind had already begun its wild, whistling cry through the valley. The cowboy hurried the last of the animals into shelter, rain soaking his shirt before he even made it back to porch. She stood in the doorway, holding a lantern, watching the lightning tear jagged lines across the sky. The moment he stepped inside, the door rattled in the wind behind him, and the world beyond vanished in a curtain of rain. Inside, the ranch house felt smaller, the storm's rage pressing against the walls. The wind moaned through every crack, the fire in the hearth flaring and snapping with each gust. With nowhere else to go, they found themselves sitting at the old wooden table, a pot of coffee between them. At first, they spoke of little things, the stubborn mule, the state of the fence, but as the rain pounded harder, their words shifted, as if the storm outside had stripped away the need for small talk. He asked her about the night of the raid, his voice quiet but steady. She hesitated, staring into her cup before finally speaking. The words came slow, each one dragging old pain into the light. How the screams had echoed, how the fire had burned too fast to stop, how she had run without looking back. She admitted the guilt she still carried, the dreams that woke her in the middle of the night. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to soothe it away. He simply listened, his rough hands folded on the table. When it was his turn, his eyes shifted to the fire. He spoke of his wife, how she'd been the only person who truly understood him, and how losing her had turned the world into something gray and hollow. He'd built walls so high that not even his friends could climb them, walls he thought would keep him from ever feeling that kind of pain again. Then, after a pause, he looked at her directly. "I haven't cared for anyone since her until you. Her breath caught. It wasn't the words alone, but the way he said them, without flourish, without expectation, like a truth too heavy to keep inside any longer. She felt her eyes fill, but these weren't the hot tears of grief or fear. They were warm, surprising, almost soft. For the first time in years, she felt something she thought she'd lost forever. Safe. Not just safe from danger, but safe in a way that made her heart steady and her lungs feel full. Lightning flashed, and the shadows leapt across the walls. He reached for her hand, hesitating only a heartbeat before his fingers closed around hers. The touch was strong, grounding, yet gentle enough to undo her completely. She let out a small, unsteady laugh, part relief, part disbelief, and in that moment she leaned forward, resting her forehead against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, and the world outside disappeared. The storm still raged, but its roar became a distant thing, muffled by the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In the stillness of that embrace, a promise formed between them. Unspoken but certain, born in the shelter of a violent night. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the ranch washed clean and glistening under a pale sky. Puddles shimmered in the dirt road, and the air carried the sharp scent of wet earth. She woke to the sound of boots pacing the porch and found him outside, scanning the distant hills through narrowed eyes. His jaw was tight, his hand resting near the rifle slung over his shoulder. Something in his stance told of the peace of the night before it had already been broken. By mid-morning, word reached them from a neighboring homestead. The bandits were back. They'd been seen riding along the ridge, stopping at ranches to intimidate and take what they pleased. Her stomach tightened, an old, familiar fear rising, but this time it wasn't the same helpless dread. She watched him check his guns, his movements calm but deliberate. When she asked if they should hide, he shook his head. Hiding doesn't stop wolves. You have to make them think twice before they cross your line. The afternoon stretched into a tense wait. Every distant hoofbeat made her glance toward the road. Finally, the sound came, clearer this time, steady and unhurried. 3 riders appeared over crest, their figures sharp against the sunlit sky. They didn't rush. They wanted to be seen. The cowboy stepped down from the porch, rifle in hand, his shadow long across the dirt. She stayed by the doorway, her heart pounding, her fingers curled around the edge of the frame. The riders stopped a few yards from the fence, their leader grinning in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you've been keeping more than cattle out here," he drawled. The cowboy didn't answer at first. He just lifted his rifle slightly, the barrel gleaming. "You heard right, and you can turn that gossip into a warning. This land's mine. So's everyone on it." His voice was low, steady, and it carried like a cold wind. One of the bandits shifted in his saddle, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver. She felt her breath catch. The cowboy's eyes locked on the man, and in the space of a heartbeat, the tension snapped, a sudden, sharp exchange of movement and noise. A shot cracked the air, dust exploding from the ground near the fence. The bandits wheeled their horses back, firing wildly as they retreated. He fired after them once, a clean, measured shot, before they disappeared over the ridge. When she ran to him, her legs felt unsteady. "You're hit," she said, seeing the blood on his arm. He tried to wave it off, but she ushered him inside, her hands firm despite their trembling. She fetched clean cloth and a small tin of salve, kneeling beside him as he sat. The wound was shallow, but she cleaned it with care, her fingers brushing the rough skin of his forearm. He watched her quietly, not protesting, just letting her work. As she wrapped the bandage, she realized something had shifted. She wasn't just someone he was protecting anymore. She was part of the fight, part of the home they were defending. She had loaded ammunition into his belt that morning, her hand steady. She had stood ready by the door, not frozen by fear. And now, tending his wound, she felt a strange, fierce pride. When she finished, he caught her hand, holding it for a moment longer than needed. "You did good today," he said, simply. It wasn't praise from a distance. It was recognition, the kind that meant she belonged here. She met his gaze and nodded, feeling the truth settle in her chest. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was his partner, in danger and in life. And no matter what came over that ridge next time, They would face it together. The morning after the standoff was quiet, almost eerily so. The land seemed to breathe again. The birds returned to their songs, and the wind carried nothing but the scent of wet earth from a night's rain. She stood on the porch, watching the horizon where the plains stretched endlessly, feeling for the first time in months that danger wasn't waiting just beyond the next ridge. The ranch, once a place of uncertainty for her, now felt like a safe harbor. Inside, the cowboy was tending his horse, the same way he always did, calm, methodical, steady. She had grown used to the rhythm of his days, to the way he worked with quiet purpose. When he finally approached her, his eyes held a softness that made her heartbeat quicken. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he stood beside her, both of them gazing out at the land. Then, almost as if the words had been sitting in his chest for weeks, he said, "You can stay here as long as you need, or you can stay forever." Her breath caught in her throat. She searched his face for hesitation, for any sign that he didn't mean it, but there was none. The man who had once spoken so little now stood before her, offering not just a home, but his heart. She thought of the trails she had walked alone, of the cold nights, the fear, the loss, and how each of those moments had led her here. This was more than safety. It was love. "I don't want to stay because I need to," she said, her voice trembling. "I want to stay because I choose you." The words seemed to light something deep in his eyes. He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. No bandits, no storms, no fear. By midday, they were saddling the horses. She wore his spare hat, slightly too big for her head, and he gave a rare, boyish smile at the sight. As they rode out, the plains stretched ahead, golden under the late afternoon sun. The sky was painted in warm hues, oranges, pinks, and soft purples, a sunset that felt like a blessing. They rode side by side, their hands brushing until finally he reached over and took hers. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was the most certain thing she had ever felt. The wind carried the scent of grass and wildflowers. The horses' hooves drummed a steady rhythm, and the horizon promised new beginnings. The land they crossed had once been a place of fear for her. Now it was home. With the setting sun at their backs and the promise of tomorrow ahead, they rode on together, hand in hand, into a life neither had dared to dream of before.